I now have great pleasure to introduce you to the second session of today, which is an academic conversations. So Keith and Oyvind will be, well, I'll let you introduce over to Dr. Carl Woods, who's a senior research fellow in Australia, who's joining us to talk today. So Keith, as you'll be in an academic conversation, you'll probably have to make your ways down the front at some stage. The conversation point. The conversation point, yes. Carl, are you there?
I am. I certainly am. Do you want me to share my screen,
yes,
James?
Please. I'm still working this bit out.
I presume you can see that all right, James?
Perfect. Yeah. Really well. Okay, Carl, so when you're ready, we'll take it away and allow you to introduce your session. I'm very excited about it because we did start to touch on some of your work in yesterday's talks and discussions. So thank you very much for joining us.
No, not at all, not at all. Firstly, thank you to yourself and Ryder and obviously Keith and Elvin for facilitating this awesome symposium. I'm very fortunate to be joining from the Mornington Peninsula down in Victoria in Australia. We've just literally today come out of 262 days of lockdown. So please, thank you. Please excuse the longer hair. I did have a shave, so I'm all good to go for the presentation today. But yeah, again, thank you very much for the opportunity to come and have a bit of a brief discussion about something that I've been spending a few years working with some wonderful colleagues, James, yourself, obviously Keith as well, and some wonderful other colleagues that I'll touch on as we go. But I want to talk a little bit today on this notion of inskilled inhabitant knowledge, specifically related to three concepts or three aspects of that I'll very briefly go through within 20 or so minutes. And that's guidance without specification, inhabitant storytelling, and wayfinding. So I think I'll start with two slightly different academics to I guess set the scene. The first of which is a quote which I regularly revisit and I often dwell on, from Rebecca Solnit, who's a wonderful essayist, and this is from a book that she wrote a few years ago now called Wanderlust: A History of Walking. And I think for me this line of research that I've been spending the last few years finding my own way through really captures, always captured within this quote, which is: to write is to carve a path through a terrain of the imagination or to point out features on a familiar route. To read is to travel through the terrain with the author as the guide. A guide one may not always agree with, but one who can at least be counted upon to take one somewhere. And that leads into the comic that you see up on screen at the moment, which is from a comic whose work I very much resonate with, his name is Nick Sousanis. And this comic captures a brilliant image of a seafarer who's standing on their vessel, presumably attuned to all this rich information within their surrounds, selectively responding to things like the movement of the ocean, the movement of the stars, perhaps other marine features that are going on, to find their way forward. And that's very much what this line of research on enskillment and inhabitant knowledge has been for myself over the last few years. It's very much been one where I'm not sure where we're going per se, but I'm selectively responding to these rich invitations that emerge as I currently find my way through. So linking that together, I want to start off going into some content today related to what it might mean to know in a performance environment more ecologically. I'll then want to propose that perhaps this ecological conceptualization of what it means to know is inseparable from doing in place, which links us into this really wonderful notion of enskillment. Then I'm going to link into how we support or could support the growth of inskilled inhabitant knowledge in others, using three concepts: effectively the role of the experienced companion, which is one of guidance without specification; inhabitant storytelling, and I'll touch very briefly at the end on wayfinding. So to start, let's jump into what it might mean to know. And I'm going to set some context with this from another scholar who I take a lot of inspiration from, namely social anthropologist Tim Enskiled. And this is an excerpt from chapter 26 of his book, The Life of Lines, which Keith and I recently wrote a paper and set a whole paper around this particular excerpt. And this is a brief snippet of it. Does knowledge actually lead to wisdom? Does it open our eyes and ears to the truth of what is there? Or does it rather hold us captive within a compendium of our own making? Might we see more, experience more, and understand more by knowing less? Which of them is wiser, the ornithologist or the poet? The one who knows the name of every kind of bird, but has them ready sorted in his head. The other who knows no names, but looks with wonder, astonishment, and perplexity on everything he sees. Now, if we unpack this excerpt a little bit further, we can start to distinguish a couple of types of knowing and knowledge and what it might mean to know, and specifically linking into some terminology from ecological psychologist James Gibson, whether it means to know about or to know of a performance environment. So let's start with the ornithologist, or for argument's sake, perhaps even a botanist or an academic. For the ornithologist, according to this excerpt, it appears that knowledge, or what it means to know, is procedural, abstract, symbolic, perhaps even documentational, where they can catalogue and record information about the birds that they interact with. So I guess we could postulate that perhaps for the ornithologist, the world is determinate. It's filled with objects that are waiting to be known about through that process of recording and cataloguing. What if we flip it? What about for the poet, or for argument's sake, that may be of a hiking guide or even an athlete? Knowing might not necessarily be something to be known about, but something that that can be primarily experienced, something that's transformational, something that's self-discovered. So I guess from that point of view, for the poet or the hiking guide or the athlete, the world is indeterminate. It's constantly regenerating in the activities of things, not objects, to be known of. And that's what I want to spend a little bit more time on over the next few slides, and perhaps even into the discussion, where it's this knowledge of the environment, which is how people come to intimately know their surrounds. I think to help people grasp this difference, as a fairly keen hiker and trail runner myself, I often lean on the differences between reading about different trails that I like to go and hike and trail run through, and actually being there. There's a vast difference between simply reading them in a guidebook and directly experiencing them for myself, directly experiencing the sights, the sounds, the tastes of perhaps different wild fruits growing and smells whilst I'm in those particular surrounds. Now, because of that notion of directly experiencing and primarily experiencing our surrounds, to know of our environment isn't necessarily to have someone transmit that knowledge or that information to us, but it's something that is grown along lines of movement. So for me, I view this notion of to know from an ecological perspective as something that we grow into and that concurrently grows into us, right? It's a process of development. It's not necessarily a process of transmission or knowledge transmission, which those from traditional Western educational institutes are perhaps a little bit more familiar. But from this perspective, to know is something that we grow into by spending time and dwelling in different landscapes or different taskscapes. So then learning from that point of view isn't necessarily one of enculturation, this notion of learning to follow rules and conventions about how things should be done, but is much more one of enskillment, of learning to discover things for ourselves within the places of which we're currently inhabiting. So what is enskillment? I like to lean on this interpretation from another anthropologist, Jean Lave, who argued that enskillment is this notion of understanding in practice as we're doing. Hence, learning is inseparable from doing in specific place, in a place. So then our knowledge of these particular tasks and these particular activities grows as we dwell, as we spend time doing a task in a particular environment. And this means that then the very process of knowing can't be leveraged or separated away from knowledge, which historically is what we look at doing. You know, we try to educate by giving someone a textbook, by telling someone to read a paper. But that kind of separates or draws away the very process of what it means to know of the things that we are subsequently reading about. So then as we instill into our environment, we're encouraged to appreciate that learning is much more about attending to things. And again, to lean on some of the words of Gibson, it's this progressive education of attention. Now you see on slide, I've got attend in inverted commas. And that's because there's two sides of attention or attend that I want to focus on in this talk. The first one, which probably we're a little bit more familiar with from some of the other talks, which is this notion of masterful attunement to specifying information about our environment. And that's rooted in the Latin interpretation of, or the etymology of the word attend, which is ad attendere, which means to stretch toward. So I'm stretching toward information about my environment that's specifying the affordances that are present. But if we go back to what I mentioned at the start for our poets, our hiking guides and our elite athletes, the world is indeterminate, right? Now, because the world is indeterminate, that means that the information to specify objects isn't necessarily already there. So our Enskiled individuals need to be selectively responsive to the various invitations that open up as they progressively go along. And that leads us into Jan Michelin's French interpretation of attend, which is attendre, which means to wait on. So as you can see, we have the two sides of the same coin, which is attention. We have our wonderful interpretation of stretching toward opportunities or invitations to act within our environment, but we also have this propitious forbearance, this waiting on these opportunities for us to subsequently carry on. So to help, I guess, concretize these ideas, I lean on concepts which or activities which are a little bit more familiar to me, which surfing and being close to the ocean is an important one. So to help us navigate these ideas a little bit more, I'd like to contrast a couple of surfers. We have a surfer who perhaps occupies the swell, but is unable to skillfully read the swell, the waves. And then we have a surfer who inhabits the swell by masterfully being attuned to information about the rips, the sets, and the lulls, but they wait on that information to catch the right wave relative to their action capabilities, the design features of their surfboard, perhaps other people that are on the wave at those particular times. So it's very much this notion of attending to this information, but also waiting on the various invitations to open up, which are most inviting for them at that particular time. Now, that knowledge then of the swell isn't gained by looking upon the swell from afar, or not by reading about the swell in a guidebook, or hearing someone tell you about the swell from a guidebook. Those types of things may help, but the actual, this rich inhabitant knowledge of the swell is only grown by spending time in it and with the swell, or in other words, dwelling with it and learning from it. Which is a really integral part of inskillment, where we can't be separated from the place in which we're growing our inhabitant knowledge of. So then learning to surf in this particular instance isn't just about the act of surfing, but it's of skillfully inhabiting the swell. And by that, I mean it's being able to read the waves, read the rips, read the local conditions to help instill oneself into what we've spoken about before in other work, instilling oneself into the taskscape, the broader rhythms of the landscape of which they're instilling into. So it's not just one of an action, it's one of being very much embedded in place. Now that leads on to a really important part. Well, how do we help someone instill into their environment? Or what role does the coach or physical educator have in the growth of this Enskiled inhabitant knowledge? Again, I've presented a really rich comic from Nick Sulsanis. I'm not going to, for time, I don't want to spend too long on it today, but I encourage you to, if you're going to watch this recording back, or take a screenshot of this slide so you can spend your own time dwelling through that particular comic, because it's very rich in this notion of guidance without specification. Instead, I'm going to lean on another quote from Tim Ingold, this time from his book Anthropology and as Education, published in 2018. And it's very much the role of the educator that I lean on heavily in this notion of inskillment, which is not to explicate knowledge for the benefit of those who are assumed by default to be ignorant, but is to provide inspiration, guidance, and criticism in the exemplary pursuit of truth. So if we're to view the role of the coach or the physical educator through the growth of inskilled inhabitant knowledge, we can kind of start to understand that it's this process of active self-discovery. Now, the word active is really important at the front end of this because it demonstrates this interaction or this correspondence between an experienced and less experienced other, right? It's this ongoing interaction between them, or to lean on Goethean science language, it's this conversation between an experienced and less experienced other. But it's of self-discovery because the less experienced other is encouraged to attend to things within the places they emerge, right? Directly as they are. So it's less of trying to specify for someone and really try to guide them towards figuring things out for themselves. Now, despite arguments to the contrary, this is very hands-on in terms of the pedagogical actions, which you'll hear from GAU later talk a little bit more about nonlinear pedagogy. It's just not in the real hands-on hard sense of instructing, right? That guidance for, but it's in the softer sense, in the direct instruction for, but it's in the softer sense of guiding towards where one may start their own search towards what things might feel, look, and sound like for themselves. Now, as I set up on the slide, doesn't specify for the individual, but nudges them towards certain invitations that they can then subsequently go on and discover for themselves. Keith often talks about this as a notion of safe uncertainty. Safe in that we're always ensuring that they're not placed in situations that could be a detriment to their enjoyment of learning, or even worse, putting them at risk of injury or illness. But uncertainty in that we're not specifying for them. They're subsequently trying to figure things out for themselves in a pleasantly frustrating way. So then how does perhaps a coach or physical educator go about supporting this guidance without specification? As I said, I'm not going to touch on the nonlinear pedagogical approaches, but I want to touch on two other elements. This first of which being inhabitant storytelling, which is a really storytelling is a really rich area, I think, of that sport and physical education can continue to unlock and harness as we find our way forward through this notion of enskillment and what it could mean. And I'll start with what it could mean to tell a story. Again, I'm going to lean on another excerpt from Tim Enskiled, this time though from his book, The Perception of the Environment, published in 2000. And for him, which very much for me, telling a story is not like weaving a tapestry to cover up the world, far from dressing up a plain reality or representing it in the imagination. Stories serve to conduct the attention of performers into the world deeper and deeper as one proceeds from an outward appearances to an ever more intense poetic involvement. Right, so what does that mean in other language? Well, stories act, and telling a story act as a way of inviting people into the landscape, learning to attend to features that have otherwise perhaps remained hidden to them. Now, because of this, stories are deeply embedded in place, right? And they only become truly educative when people venture into these places for themselves. And I haven't touched on it in this presentation, but I will very briefly just mention the etymology of the word education, because it's important here. The etymology of education, which I tend to lean on a little bit, is exducere, which means to lead out, right? So as we tell a story, we're leading people out into place. So to give you an idea, the Pintupi people, Indigenous people of Western Australia, here in my home country, they often tell stories of place, but before they do that, they take people out into the place of which they're telling them the story of, right? So they experience the landscape as it is, as they're hearing the story, right? So it's this really integral element that stories are told as we are dwelling in the environment of which we're subsequently told about. So I want to give you a little bit of a story. It is a bit of a downfall of the presentation that you can't be on this hiking trail with me at the moment whilst I'm telling you this story, but I want to tell you a really brief story about moss, a hiking trail, and the rain. So as I mentioned at the start, I'm a ferocious hiker and trail runner. I spend a lot of my time on the trails when I can, when we're not in lockdown. And this is a story I often discuss. While hiking with inexperienced companions, I, myself, an experienced hiker of this specific region of the Adelaide Hills, which I grew up, I regularly tell a story of the time I slipped down this hillside as I didn't notice the moss growing on the rocks at this time of the year. I elaborate on how I've progressively noticed that the moss tends to grow faster after heavy rainfall and how it's hard to see because the colour blends into the granite on which it grows, which is a rock on which it grows, but that it's easier to feel and hear the moss underfoot as its texture is often softer than the rocky surrounds. Now, as I'm telling this story, we're obviously embedded in the hiking trail, we're embedded in place. And I often use like subtle gestures, my arm movements, and perhaps pointing to certain features to guide my companion's attention toward the moss. Now, I don't want to specify for them. I don't want to tell them to subsequently avoid it. I actually encourage them to see it, but more specifically to feel and hear what carefully walking over it is like. So again, it comes back to this notions of guidance without specification. I'm guiding them towards it. I'm encouraging them to attend to it. But as I mentioned before, it's in a way that hopefully is a little bit safe but uncertain. So they can start to learn to attend to features of the landscape for themselves. So when they go back to hike these trails, they can progressively start to embed their own narratives into these stories. Now, the important part of inhabitant storytelling isn't just how we tell a story, but it's how we listen to stories that have been told to us. Brian Watchu and Alex Prinz, who are some fantastic outdoor education academics at Federation University here in Victoria, they've spent a fair bit of their time understanding what actually listening to inhabitant stories means, what it could mean. And what they've concluded is that we need to be empathetic towards the stories being told. As we're listening to stories, as people are telling us stories, the goal isn't to interrogate what they're saying to us. It's not to try to extract facts and objective measurements and data about the story that we can then subsequently attach into the landscape, but it's to appreciate that the stories that we hear, this inhabitant storytelling, really is only educative. Remember the etymology of the word education, to be let out, as we immerse ourselves in the place. Now, this means that the same stories that we hear may subsequently change as our knowledge of our surrounds or as our knowledge of the landscape starts to change and starts to deepen as we go from being an occupant to one as being an inhabitant. Martina Tyrell, another anthropologist, in her ethnography of Inuit wayfinders, mentions this brilliantly in 2006. She discusses how children, these Inuit children who are learning to seafare, they hear these stories growing up of the ocean and of the sea, but the stories only really become truly educative when they venture to see for themselves, not even with someone else, but for themselves. And that's because these stories start to deepen in their meaning as they experience them, but they can also start to thread their own narratives into the stories. So these stories generationally continue on between generations and continue to evolve as the landscape, as the skiscape continues to subsequently change. All right, the last slide, which I'll touch on, is this notion of the questioning wayfinder. Again, another Nick Sulsanis comic, which really captures my interpretations of wayfinding, which by no means are the interpretations of wayfinding. They're just an interpretation of wayfinding, which is this very, very rich, deep attunement to place, but also this notion again of waiting on. And you can see our seafarer attuned to all this information about their environment, from the movement of the stars to the illuminations of presence of undersea life and so on. But again, I'll encourage you to spend a little time in that. I want to just very quickly start on this notion of wayfinding, because it's often synonymous with navigation, but it's far more than navigation from an Enskillment perspective, right? I often think our words, and you would have heard me talk a little bit etymologically of words throughout this presentation, words are very important within an Enskillment approach, because wayfinding in this instance across a landscape is very much different to wayfinding through a landscape, specifically as well to reach a destination. If we are to travel or navigate across a landscape, we're to perhaps understand that a little bit more as transport, where we're passengers. We rely on a map, a GPS, or something else to mediate or specify our navigation for us. So I think about sitting on a train. The train is mediating my transport for me. I'm a passenger on the train going across a landscape toward a predefined destination. Absolutely nothing wrong with that, but that is not wayfinding from an Enskillment point of view. I guess applied to sport, that could be synonymous to a procedural manual about how a skill should be done, which breaks it up into these predefined ways or the sequential parts to be mastered in isolation, decontextualized, and then perhaps put together in context. That might be this notion of transporting or taking an athlete from being a wayfinder to perhaps being a passenger as we're specifying how things should be done for them. But as I mentioned before, wayfinding for our Enskilled inhabitants isn't necessarily about following a pre-specified route in advance, because for them, the destination is subsequent to the journey. What I mean by that is the actual process of finding one's way is the very important part of why they're finding their way, why they're wayfinding. And this is because knowledge, as they find their way, is progressively grown through these rich interactions and correspondences with their surrounds within their landscapes. And that's why we often refer to knowledge growth for Enskiled wayfinders as being grown along, or the neologism alongingly, rather than it being vertically integrated from this theory or concept which is transmitted down into people. Wayfinders grow their knowledge along lines or paths of movement. Now, how do we help people attend to this really rich information and grow their knowledge along paths of movement? Questions can be a really important feature for our experienced companions, which can guide without specifying the environment or the information within their environment for them. And again, a very brief vignette to finish off the wayfinding young tennis player. Well, to help a young tennis player learn to find their way through the ebbs and flows of a match, a coach may ask questions during practice that guides the attention of the young player towards things like, how deep is your opponent placed on the court? Could you generate spin on the ball when you hit a backhand? Where does your opponent often place the ball on their first serve? Now, the important part of these questions, if we're to understand this learning process as wayfinding and this knowledge growth as wayfinding, is that the answers to these questions don't necessarily need to be verbalized by the young tennis player. I don't need to tell you about what I should do, or where the opponent is placed on the court, or how often they place their serve in a certain region of the court. But these questions are very much designed to act as one of encouraging them to interact with the different affordances present within their environment, to start to action their responses. And me as the coach is to stand back and observe how they interact with it, because their answer, so to speak, might be very different to my answer. It doesn't mean that theirs is right and mine is wrong, or mine is right and theirs is wrong. It's that they're different. And it's appreciating that how they find their way through the game might be very different to how I find my way through the game. Just like we may all find our various ways to where we are here today, but we're subsequently all here at this particular time point. So I reckon I've probably spoken well over the time, Keith and Elvin, which I'm sure you can all gather. I have a propensity to keep talking. So I might stop there so we can at least get some discussion in.
Thank you very much, Carl. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to invite Keith and Oivind up to have a discussion and a conversation with Carl. I'm going to listen in for the first few minutes, just let them kind of talk about this concepts and points and anything. Yeah, just let them have a chat, and then they will invite us to join in on that conversation. And I have quite a few people already online who are keen to do so. So thanks again, Carl. That was absolutely wonderful.
Carl, you ready to have a conversation? Actually, I would have preferred the previous version, Carl, in conversation with himself, because it was absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, sorry, I guess we're a bit unsure as to how to start the discussion up. I guess, Keith, this is something that you and I have spent a few years working on. These ideas have been something that you and I have spent a few years finding our own way through. And I think what we've progressively found is that these concepts are fairly well established in other fields like social anthropology, that they perhaps are using methodologies like microethnographies to help explore some of these ideas in a little bit more depth, which perhaps bodes really nicely, I guess, to the theme of the symposium on this notion of transdisciplinarity, right? Where we can take ideas very rich from other fields and learn to integrate them, but not necessarily apply them, but perhaps manipulate them in different ways in sporting context to help us understand learning and knowledge in a little bit more depth in perhaps ways that we may not have necessarily considered by viewing just sports science or physical education literature. Is that something you would agree with?
Absolutely. Do you want to come in a little bit more? Do you want to?
You can start.
I can start, yeah. No, I think it's fascinating. Our discussions over, actually over the last 2 years, because the first time we met in person was at Kiscalio in 2019, face to face, and then a lot has happened in the 2 years, and I'm delighted for you coming out of lockdown, the longest lockdown in the world for any place, of course, Melbourne, and you look like you're thriving with it. But we've had quite a few of these discussions by Zoom. And one of the things that strikes me about them is how a lot of these ideas that you've driven the way that you've gone to other sources of literature, which are very relevant, adopting and living this transdisciplinary perspective. But a lot of these ideas can easily be taken back to insights of James Gibson, a very powerful insights of James Gibson concerning, for example, the conceptualization of knowledge and Gibson's helpful distinction between knowledge about something which is used in a specific way, categorizing things, labeling things, recording things, being able to verbally describe things, versus knowledge of something which is gained, as you say, in a dynamic way, is ongoing, and involves dwelling in place, inhabiting, and you get a real picture of somebody actually. So when I think of when I use the term interactions, when I talk about coaches and PE teachers encouraging learners to interact with the environment, these sorts of ideas are what I have in mind of somebody who is learning and not learning things in discrete packages, as you pointed out in your description of how some teachers and coaches will break up tasks for learners, but learning by doing, learning by discovering, as Harvard talked about yesterday. And for me, that in terms of the physical education aspect, that provides some very interesting insights into the role of the physical educator based on a Gibsonian ecological approach, which is really about guiding, about helping them to perceive, because you remember that Gibson talked about knowing the environment is based on perceiving, perception, and then acting, not just perception alone. And then in your wonderful narrative just now, the way that you talked about narration and storytelling, it made me really think about how teachers and coaches can use more of that example, not just questions, because that can be a useful method, but really modeling things by providing narratives as well. Yeah. When I was in a situation, I faced this current, for example, and I was able to avoid it in a certain way. How did you avoid it then? So it's more of a idea of providing an idea of co-designing. One of the papers we've written in the last 2 years about working, collaborating together with the learner to find a way. So I'll stop there before it's I'm conversing with myself.
Okay. Sorry. Oh no, I was just going to jump on the back of that and say a really key element of this notion of guidance without specification and the role of the educator or the coach is, and I think it's one of the reasons why Enskilment is such a powerful concept for me, is that it really calls into question, or brings into play the importance of humility in the educative process, where it's not the coach or the teacher who has to have all the answers. It's that these answers emerge as we head out into these landscapes together and we learn to correspond together. So that means me, even as an experienced hiker of that region, which I spoke about in that narrative, I have as much to learn from you, an inexperienced companion, as you have from me. Perhaps what I learn from you and what you learn from me might be different, but I'm still subsequently learning as I'm corresponding, or as you say, interacting. The reason I like corresponding is because it captures this notion of a conversation where there is no fixed endpoint and that we can correspond all the time. And as we correspond, new ideas emerge and new ways of being come to fruition, where in discussions that we've had in the past has led to really rich lines of inquiry, which we can follow on with. But I think to me, it comes back to, and similar to the notion of co-design, it really comes back to this element of humility, of being humble as educators and being humble as academics and scientists, that the answers aren't necessarily all out there waiting for us to simply discover, but they emerge as we correspond and immerse ourselves in place. And what we often find, perhaps, are just more questions, not necessarily answers, but just more questions to these really complex things that we correspond with as we go. Sorry, Alvin, I cut you off.
No, I was thinking of the concept of bodily learning that is coming into the Norwegian context, and not just bodily as in motor learning, but also as in affective feelings and everything. That the concept of bodily learning embraces all. So that was my thought. And I also thought of your example from the surfers, and which corresponds to the ecological dynamics and the third level of being able to exploit the dynamics of the environment, and this relation between the environment and the person, and how you can adapt your movements according to the information that is surrounded by, be able to read the waves and when to get into the board, what kind of waves are big enough so you can ride them. And these are because of the experience as an individual, and through a lot of experience, you are more, you release the degrees of freedom, and you're able to exploit the dynamics. I was thinking of that. And a third thing that struck me is there is, I think it's Scottish philosopher, Peter Arnold, who is talking about learning in movement. He's talking about learning through movement, and also learning about movement, and how the physical education embraces those things, those concepts.
I absolutely. I think it's your point about surfing is really profound, because it attacks the very core of this whole notion, which is that what we learn when we learn things isn't perhaps the action that we see, but it's learning how to continually adapt that action to our surrounds. So as I instill into the swell, as I become as I go from being an occupant to an inhabitant, I learn how to surf, not necessarily by following a template of how to surf, but I learn to read the conditions. I learn to read how to manipulate features of my surfboard to fit the wave. I learn how to perform certain tricks that are really specific, these socio-cultural constraints to that particular swell. I start to inhabit to what we refer to in an Enskiled approach as the broader taskscape, right? Which shapes me, but really importantly, by my corresponding with the taskscape, I shape it. So it's this constant notion of appreciating the suffix scape. The etymology of it means shape. This constant notion of land or the task being shaped through my correspondences. So I'm shaped, I'm shaping it, and it's shaping me. But it's a really important part, which goes back to a lot of Keith's work, a lot of Duarte's work from the early 2000s and even into the 90s. Where learning is very much contextualized. We learn in place. It's not to disregard perhaps the importance of knowing about our environment, but as I think it's ecological psychologist Edward Reed in his book, the importance of primary experience. He articulates that before we can share experiences, before I can tell you about an environment, I have to experience it myself, or in other words, I have to know of it, which from my perspective, from my worldview, To know of is it perhaps comes before to know about. I need to have an experience before I can tell you about it, or before I can write about it, or before I can convey it to you, which then is this notion of encouraging you to perhaps go and experience it for yourself too. I often think, I'm perhaps quite bullish on it, I often think somewhere in a lot of the educational institutes, perhaps what I'm more familiar with in Australia, we've gone away from that, and we're very much focused on a model of knowledge transmission, knowledge about transmission, where I can tell students about everything they need to know, supposedly, to function as people in the world. And perhaps they've never experienced any of the things that I'm telling them about for themselves. So I think it's a really important, large systemic issue that faces us as coaches, as scientists, as physical educators, and so on.
I'd just like to make a quick interjection there, Carl. Yeah, that's great. I really like that point you made about educators having humility and expressing that humility in understanding that they don't know all the answers, and maybe society, organizations should take the pressure off educators and not cast them in that role as the expert, the go-to person who's in charge of everything and a fount of all knowledge about the environment. But instead to be a guide working with the learner in co-designing, finding a way forward. Why this is important? Because I've always tried to emphasize individualized approach to learning and performance. And obviously that's captured in the constraints model as personal constraints that interact with the task and the environment. So we shouldn't be surprised. In fact, we should be quite welcoming and understanding of someone solving a particular performance problem in their own way, which might not be according to a manual or a template model, but conceptualizing the role of the teacher or coach as a guide working alongside that team, then is really about wayfinding, helping that person to find a way to the solution. One of the outcomes that I hope will come from this symposium is last night with my colleagues at NTNU, we were discussing a paper that we want to write, which essentially talks about a constraints-led approach, not in skill adaptation, as you beautifully captured with the surfing example, but we're talking about a constraints-led approach to teacher education. So the teachers or the educators of teachers and coaches adopting a constraints-led approach so they can be a guide with a teacher to find the way. And here's this range of methodologies. I think Laura expressed it very well in her talk this morning. You've got a wide range of methodologies. Some are linear, pedagogy, some are non-linear, and it's about selecting and using some that are suitable for each individual. And the proviso is probably that most of the approaches used would be non-linear in basis. I know James wants to bring some.
Yeah, I do. No, I think thanks, Keith, for some really good points. And there's going to be certainly lots of opportunities for continuing to share lots of different knowledge across many mediums out of this symposium. I'd like to invite in Katie, Duarte and Gun as well to join in this conversation, just for a quick 5 minutes, because we are over time. And then Duarte, if you can stay on. Carl, if I can ask you to stop sharing your screen now so we can see everyone on the screen. And hopefully, yeah, so if both three people could join, and yeah, we'll carry on this conversation. Thank you.
Hello. Hello, Carl. Hello, Keith. Hello, James. Very, very pleased to see you.
How are you?
In different parts of the world. Well, just a comment about the great presentation from Carl. I like very much how especially embeddedness is being developed by his reasoning. And I think this is a very important thing to develop. I think we moved from an anthropocentric way of understanding behavior to a brain-centric way of understanding behavior. And now there is, I think, a good move towards the embodiment. But I think if we just stay on the embodiment, we are also emphasizing too much the organism. Because, for example, we understand movement as something just to make us feel better, for example. And in this sense, we are somehow disconnecting with the world. So we are just doing something for our own private feelings. And I think what Carl is telling is something very profound, is that we are more than our bodies, even though that our attention to the body is very important, the embodiment is very important, but we are in the world, we are interacting and being mixed with the world. And all this process evolves in a way that goes beyond our skin and goes beyond our previous solutions. And this is how embeddedness is about. So I think this understanding of embeddedness and how the consequences of this understanding to behavior, I think are very profound. Curiously, I think they match very well, as Keith said before, with Gibson, and even before Gibson with Kurt Lewin, with his field theory, when he says that we can understand behavior not just based on individual characteristics, but based on what's going on around the individual. And this idea of field theory, I think, clearly can make us think differently about behavior. The field theory says something like a magnetic field will be responsible for the behavior of a tiny piece of iron. So the tiny piece of iron is important because if it's a piece of bread, it will not be attracted by the magnetic field. So the individual is important and with its own characteristics, but the behavior cannot be explained just by the characteristics of the individual. It's on these circumstances, on these magnetic fields where the iron is in interaction with the other pieces of iron, that we can understand the behavior of that particular piece. So I think this metaphor that Kurt Lewin brought to psychology was a great starting point that somehow we lose in the way. And now I think Carl is really recovering it in a way which I think is more profound, because it goes beyond the individual, goes to the entire community, how it evolves and shapes each other and co-adapt. So I would like to emphasize this the embeddedness that Carl is promoting so well.
Duarte, you touched on a very, very profound point from James Gibson's work, where I guess as humans, we have a propensity to exceptionalize ourselves, but we only know of this world because we are of this world. And I think the thing that really resonates with me from this line of this transdisciplinary line of inquiry through Enskillment is that it really pushes against this human exceptionalism, right? We aren't humans on top of the world, but we are organisms within the world, right? So we often try to manipulate, to change features of our world to suit us. But I think we're starting to appreciate that by doing so, we're disentangling the importance of other organisms, other forms of life, and how they subsequently enrich us without us perhaps necessarily appreciating it, because we have this human exceptionalism. Going even further, that human exceptionalism then leads into a behavioral exceptionalism, where we just look at the real mechanistic insights of movement, where we can whittle that down to a Newtonian view of prediction, where we can predict what people will do, because we seem to think we have this human-centric view of the world, of which we don't just live in, but a world of which we subsequently share with infinitely varying, really entangled form of life. As I speak to you now, there's a jetty, which is a boardwalk that goes out into the ocean, which we're down here in the Mornington Peninsula, which the local council is having a very strong argument to keep, but the government wants to eradicate. Now, the government wants to eradicate it because it is a danger to people walking on it, but the local council wants to keep it because it harbours life for seahorses. So that's this notion that the inhabitants appreciate that we are only of this world, we are not exceptional to it, but that it's this constant battle between trying to make the world suitable for us, but also appreciating that as we do that, we subsequently take away affordances, which are knots in these multi-species entanglements. We take away these affordances for other forms of life, which inadvertently can be enriching us. without us perhaps even knowing. So a little bit more philosophical than what we were going into, but Duarte, exactly your point that we only know of this world because we are of this world.
Thank you, Carl. Thank you, Duarte. Some very profound discussions. I want to bring Katie in because Katie's gave a lovely example of what the environment children are currently wayfinding through and how teachers are potentially at the moment using storytelling and so forth. And get your thoughts, Carl, on maybe how, we maybe need to flip this or, just your thoughts. Thank you. Can't hear you, Katie. No. Carl, can you scroll up and see Katie's on the chat? You'd see Katie while she's seeing if she can. Sorry, I don't have one next to my laptop.
I've got it yet. Thinking of storytelling and embedding. Could you provide an example of how you could apply this within physical education lessons, especially for those who don't have access to outdoor areas? Yeah, brilliant, Katie. Brilliant question. Without throwing it straight to you, James, I actually think you're probably in a strong position to answer this, given your background. And for those that have read our paper Wayfinding, which we published last year, James actually contributed the really wonderful section on physical education and the importance of story and analogy in helping children navigate, but richer than that, learning children wayfind through different playscapes that they're subsequently exposed to in gymnasiums and places like that, where it's not necessarily an outdoor environment. But James, I guess, without handballing, I think
it's a good question. And I'm happy to try to answer it. I think quite often in teaching or in education, we would use, say gymnastics, we might use a bear shape or a caterpillar, ask them to act like animals, but we're thinking we're doing that to improve their strength and their flexibilities and these other kind of mechanistic ways of understanding. But actually, if we take it back to more how a hunter-gatherer tribes would appreciate or understand that, it's not about them improving these capacities as such. It's more about embodying that animal and getting the effectivities and seeing the world through that animal's eyes. So you can use in gymnastics a monkey, and if you've got the equipment out, that affords climbability and exploration of the environment from up high. And you'll see this nonlinear change in their performance because they embody the effectivities of those animals. And then, and they explore and they imagine. So they're not covering up as much yet, they're looking through the eyes of that animal and embodying those. It's the same if it would be a mouse, they would run quickly. Okay, that's because they embody the animal and how it moves and interacts with that world. And through that, we will see self-organization and changing and developing of these capacities, which potentially transfer wider across. So I think we often get hung up on the mechanics when actually, we need to understand a bit more, have a knowledge of the environment that child is gaining through the eyes of, they're not pretending, they're embodying those animals. So that's what I would say, and that's what that example explored in our wayfinding paper. Okay, I'm gonna, if it's okay, bring back this conversation to a close. So now we have, and I think we've really nicely led into Duarte's presentation for us on ecological cognition. So thank you so much again, Carl. It's wonderful to see you. Batten down those hatches so I can see the thunder and lightning, the storm's approaching. So, and take care and have a lovely weekend.
Thank you very much, guys. It's been a joy to be here. Hopefully, in the near future, I can be there in person with you all. But thank you very much. Too.
Great. Thank you. We'll do after this one. Hey, Duarte, if you could share your screen, please. And okay, Duarte, so it's a great pleasure. I've had a number of conversations with Duarte more recently over Skype, and there's been very rich conversations, and me trying to explore what ecological cognition is and get a better understanding and just have a really lovely conversations. And from that, I asked if Duarte would be happy to present today on ecological cognition. So I'll pass over to you, Duarte, and thanks again for being here with us.
Hello, James, and hello, everybody. It's really a pleasure to participate in this very interesting meeting. And it's also much easier after the talk from Carl, and of course with comments from Keith. So I think I only have some repetition to offer to you. The idea that I discussed with James, it was to talk a little bit about ecological cognition and how we can maybe even move beyond this concept of ecological cognition to more a cognizant body. So not a cognition that has a body, but a body that is intelligent in itself. When we think about skill, we tend to find two main answers in the literature. The first is that when we think where the skill came from, and after Carl's talk, I think you know that there are more answers than these two. And the first answer to this question is that skill is born. We are not, the talent is born, and then the skill is a consequence of that. And the idea is that our heritability influences the variation of a given phenotype. So genotype influences what phenotype we can have, and then the phenotype is somehow, according to this piece of literature, related with skill. So this is one of the main answers we find in the literature. The other one is a little different, and it's also very pervasive. It's that we acquire skill. And I think this movie, The Matrix, really illustrates that we can acquire high-level martial arts skills with a link with downloads from a computer to the nervous system, and then in a second after we can perform high-level martial arts. So the idea is that skill is acquired through mental representations that are specific to the task, and they expedite the planning and the execution of both tasks. But I think these two main answers for addressing skill, they have problems. When we think about skill is in the genes, and I'm quoting a geneticist, which I truly admire, Yannis Pitsiladis, and he wrote in the journal Lancet some time ago that the current genetic evidence does not warrant genotyping an individual to establish their ability to run fast when this trait can be measured far more effectively with a stopwatch. So what he's saying is that we cannot understand skill if we do a genotyping. We can understand better the skill when we measure the skill itself, and when we measure the running. And I think this is quite profound from a geneticist who is working in sports, and recently he reaffirmed that this is the state of the art. This is not to say that genetics is not important. It simply indicates that it's not the determinant of skill, it's a constraint. And the second approach that places everything in the mental representations, they somehow assume that the mind becomes skilled. So where skill comes from, it comes from the mind. So the mind is skilled in anticipating, controlling, and evaluating the course of action. This means that the rest of the person is replaceable. So it clearly neglect of the body. So what we know from sports is that the whole performer does something somewhere, and all these things, the performer, the something, the task, and the somewhere, the environment, all of these three are important to understand skill. So we have to move beyond something that the performer possesses, or something that the performer acquires, like genes or mental representations. And we have to consider skill and action at the level of the whole body and the environment. So when we understand sport, we understand that there are people with a body which includes nervous system, with all the interactions that this implies, and this person with these characteristics are interacting with other persons with also a body and a nervous system. So the interesting thing here is that the possibilities are infinite. There is no one solution that can be predetermined in the body of an individual or in the nervous system. This is why it is so important to understand behavior at the level of the performer environment system. And I think this is a very profound and key issue. We tend, due to our history in science, to understand or the environment or the individual, to understand how both things work together to understand behavior. I think it's a very important step that Carl very well illustrated and theorized about. And the difficulty that we have is that we developed our science to measure the components, not the interactions. And all these things happen much more in the interactions. The complexity lies in these links, not necessarily in how we address the components, which we know about, but we don't know how they interact with each other, the components of a body, and how a body with a nervous system and cardiovascular system, locomotor system interacts with other bodies with the same characteristics. This is where the complexity lies. So for this, we have to understand action at this level, not as an order from the mind that tells where pieces of anatomy should be placed in space and time, but that's something else. First is to understand that actions are not reactions. Reaction can be a particular case of actions, but actions go much beyond reactions. And this is because behavior is not intrinsically mechanical. It's not just something that is triggered to perform always the same thing, as all the idea of motor programs indicates. But it's intrinsically functional, meaning that it's to achieve something. And this, if we understand that behavior is for that, is how we can achieve something, we understand that why there are so many solutions to achieve the same thing. And these solutions vary across individuals and across the same individual. So there are all this abundance of ways of achieving the same goal. And I'm going to illustrate this with artistic gymnastics, which tends to be a very understood as a unique solution to perform a certain move. In this sense, actions are adjustments of the person environment system. It's how this system co-evolves to achieve something. And in this sense, we should understand cognition clearly embedded in this idea. And if we understand action in this way, so therefore cognition is this ongoing active maintenance of this robust person environment system. So how can we maintain this system between the person and the environment across a given time? And this is achieved by closely coordinated perception and action. Information that leads to movement and movement that leads to information. So in this sense, action is inherently cognitive. There's no cognition guiding the action. Cognition in this sense, and as now generally is being discussed, is embedded and embodied, but I think it's more than that. I think agency is about cognizant bodies. It's not simply to give a body to cognition. It's that the body is itself a cognizant entity. So our cognition is not particularly located in the piece of anatomy called nervous system, which is of course very important for our functioning, as all the other parts of our body are. And this is why I think the thinking from Gibson was so revolutionary. He didn't thought about the environment as neutral entities like time and space, which are independent from our scales. If we talk about milliseconds, that time is difficult to be conceived, or million years, we can abstractly understand that, but that is not really our scale. And Gibson said that the environment does not need to be understood for human behavior in in such a neutral unit. We can understand behavior on the environment in behavioral terms. And this is what he meant by the affordances. So we perceive the environment in terms of what we can do with it. This is very important because this also says that there is much more things in the environment that we cannot act upon. We cannot act upon ultrasounds, infrared patterns of lights, we cannot ultraviolet. There are many things in the environment that we are not perceived, but we perceive the environment in terms of how we can act in it. So the environment is always much more rich than what we can do with it. This is important because if we assume that we have to place the environment inside of our heads, we are losing all these possibilities that go much beyond our current skill. So when performing, individuals are not experiencing the object as such, and this share is a good example. The individual does not need to perceive the object as such, but what he wants to achieve in this object affords him to achieve that. So it's a resource that allows this individual to achieve something. And this is important because we don't have to attribute a label to the object. We have to act upon the object in terms of what it offers to us. This is what affordances really means. And affordances in this sense are always dependent of the action capabilities of the individual. For example, I could not do what the third person here is doing with the chairs due to skill. So skill also opens possibilities that are present with those with that skill and are not present with people without that skill. And the interesting thing here is that if we focus on action, we also need to understand information. And in this sense, a key issue of how action evolves over time, how action generates action. So what we know is that from learning, actions originate new actions, more sophisticated actions. And this is based on information, particularly in prospective information. That's why we go much beyond just reacting. We act prospectively. And prospective information is information about the current future. You see in this picture that this football player is organizing his behavior in terms of how to intercept the ball. So it's not about a stimulus from the past that he is reacting, is converging to the information offered by the ball in terms of the circumstances where he is. And the trajectory of the ball is guiding what he can do, if he has to jump, when he has to jump, if he has to move for one place or for the other, if he has to accelerate in a certain moment. So it's the information from the outside that is telling him what to do. And this means that actions are what we are learning is really how to use this prospective information. And by learning to use this prospective information, so how we are more embedded in the world, this means that we are also changing. Our actions, our skills, our bodies are changing, and the way we perceive that information is also changing. So we are co-evolving according to how we learn to use this prospective information to fulfill a certain task. Here I show you an example of a novice juggler and a skilled juggler. This was taken from an old paper from Peter Beek. And the point I'd like to illustrate here is that the skilled juggler does not lose the variability. It's always there. There's always this adjustment of the individual to the environment. The type of variability from the hand's trajectory that you can see in blue and the eye movements that we can see in pink are different from the novice. So the novice may have a more coarse-grained way of using variability. The skilled juggler it's more restricted to what is relevant. But this is what skilled performance is about, is to see when there is a relevant change and act upon that change. So not all changes are relevant, and the skilled performer is using this prospective information to act on the relevant changes. This is why also intentionality is so important. So we are converging from the multiple things that we can do towards those that are related with the task. So intentionality is also very important for attunement. And intentional in this sense means converging to the task goals. And this maintenance of this performer and environment equilibrium always implies a certain degree of variability in the skilled performer. Use these possibilities, these redundance or abundance of ways of acting to maintain this equilibrium. So this is also an issue for embedded intentionality. And a recent paper clearly illustrates how these things are not acquired or possessed by the individual, why skill is not possessed or acquired by the individual. And in this paper from Mattis and colleagues, he was showing that a runner on a path of irregularly spaced stepping stones, he must adjust the stride length in order to hit the stones rather than the spaces between them. So this is not something that can be programmed or into genes. This adjustment is governed by the vertical impulse that is supplied by the support foot, such that the impulse is large when the next stone is far, and it's small when the next stone is near. So it's the perspective information that is adjusting the body what to do, the person what to do. So all these things are being guided by how we are immersed in the environment. And what was shown was that this vertical impulse is modulated by this optical property called tau, the time to contact, time to intercept the stone. This time to intercept the stone has to do with the speed we are running, our own body characteristics, so it's clearly action scaled. Well, by presenting this, now I would like to give you an example of Filipa Martins. Curiously, she is competing now in Japan. She went to the finals of all around in artistic gymnastics, and tomorrow she will be in the final of uneven bars. And I would like to tell you the example of uneven bars, a skill that she created called Martins, dedicated to her name, of course. And I would like to make this in with three key words: possibility, potentiality, and actuality. So the possibility for performing a new skill arrived to Filipa when she could make the minimum to be in the European Artistic Gymnastics Championships in April 2021 of this same year. So this was not a possibility for me because I could not make the minimum, but it was for her. So it's not a probabilistic thing. It's a possibility because she makes it possible. This is a very important distinction between possibility and probabilities. Probabilities may not be never real, and possibilities are real. And from June 2020, she trained for 9 months. This is a curiosity. So this skill took 9 months to be born, and because she trained to the championships that were in April. And what she was doing when she decided that there was something new that she could make, she never did it before, she was making this possibility a potentiality, something that she could manage to perform in some other context where she was not in the moment. So on the 21st April 2021, in the European Championship qualifyings, this new skill was born. And I mean by this, it was realized, it was actualized. It's called the Hindorf to mixed grip. And it was the first time it was born because it was socially accepted as that. So skill is also related with this social aspect of being recognized among the peers. And it was recognized by gymnastics code of points. I just want to show you directly the skill, and then I'd like to show you how she arrives there. So this is the new skill. I just show you briefly. This is this movement that she did. It's very fast. Now in slow motion, you see, it's this Hindorf, and then she do this mixed grip with the half turn. And this was, now is named Martins. And I'd like to show you, this is quite rare, that she filmed all these 9 months what she was doing. Now here she is trying for the first time. It is the first time she could grip before the grasp. Before this, she was always falling. It was the first time she found it was possible. And what you can see is that she's in a very protected place. It's a soft pit full of mats, and the coach is designed that for her just to be focused on the task, and other things around are controlled, are protected, for her not be concerned with safety issues. You see the mats in the lower bar. So all these things are made in a way that only perceptual attunement and calibration to that information is what is about. And what you see is that she's not falling so much. She's still with some adjustments that she needs to do. And she's moving from this Martins skill, trying to continue it for a new skill in the lower bar. So this is a very important thing is gymnastics. It's not just performing the skill, but what happens before the skill and what happens after the skill in the entire choreography of the exercise. So what we are seeing here is how she's evolving with this. She has already moved out of the pit. She's now in the normal gymnasium. You see the protections are being reduced. The coaches are very clever in designing these environments to help the athlete converge her intentions to the task goal and not to be distracted by safety or by whatever reason it is. That's why the coach are so active, trying to make her safe in every moment. But more than just performing the skill, all these sequences. So what happens before? Now she's doing a Kachev before the Martins and trying to make it smooth to continuing from the Kachev to the Martins. But not only that matters, it matters also to do it in different environments, and she's practicing in different gymnasiums. This is very important. It means that it's not something that is being stored on her, but she's learning how to act upon this information. It's a very narrow window of information, spatial time information, where she can move in the way that she can perform this skill. And this is evolving over time. Sorry, there was a bigger move than I expect. Let me just see, where am I? And let me just put this, yeah. And here, you see that, this was the first time she presented this skill before the qualifyings. They have to do this for the jury before the final, before the qualifyings. It was not the final. And only then in that moment, the skill was born. The jury could code it in the gymnastics code of points. And then in the final, she performed it. And it was because she completed it in the qualifying, sorry, not the final, that the skill was part of the history of gymnastics. So this is an interesting thing, because you see how a possibility she developed the potentiality and then she actualized it in this moment. I think this has to do with three things. And here we combine with Kip Davids and many other colleagues, we combine the ideas from Bernstein with those of David Jacobs, for example, Carl Newell, to understand this sequence of phases that are very much entangled, how skill evolves over time, that to move from possibility to potentiality to actuality. So the first step we think is the search. The search we think is based on training intention, to converging the personal intentions towards the task goal. We can do many things every time, but we are converging to the task goals. So it's how this process of convergence is about, and how to cope with the situation and maintaining it ongoing. And if we are on the task, then we start to use better information and use that information in the moments where they are useful for what we are doing. And then how we act on this information. And this is what effectivities and skills and what Felipe Martins is about, is how to act in such a precise and complex way in those particular windows of information that happens in the uneven bars. And now the main difference between potentiality and actuality. Now, 3 days after, she is in the final. And in the final, where she is now, after the qualifying that I just showed you, she is, for the first time, it's the first time she is in the Portuguese gymnast, is on the final, and she's going to make her exercise. And I would like to show it. It's only a few seconds. So she started the movement, she did the Kachev, and then she moves to the Martins. But when she moves to the Martins, the sequence is broken and she fell. So this is why movement is so rich and so fascinating. It's different, the potentiality from the actuality. So the potentiality existed but not the actuality in this particular moment. How she accommodated her particular states with the states of the environment was not successful. So we can move from this idea of possibility, probability, a bare possibility, towards a real possibility. It's what she did to create that performance in the European Gymnastics Championship, a real possibility. And then she trained to perform the Martins, so she developed the skill to become possible to realize it there. It becomes a real potentiality, and then she could make it an actuality in the qualifyings, but not in the finals. So this is a cascade of constraints that is being reduced from potential possibility and potentiality that in many different places, and then accommodating the specificities of the circumstance of performance. And I think a key issue to understand this is metastability. So in the D situation, there's no coupling between the individual and the environment, let's suppose in this way. In the B state, there's only one solution that the person explores, but when there are some changes, this solution is no longer possible. Another possibility is to have three solutions, and when they do not work, the performer do not solve the situation. And what we see in skilled athletes is that they don't have a ready-made solution. They are adjusting over time in this metastable regime to perform what they need to do. So this is how we think and this is explained in this book, how we move from the skill, the potentiality, how our history is shaping our current possibilities, how we are oriented towards the future, towards the affordances of the future, and how we are accommodating the constraints of the present, in constraints related with us and related to the performance situation. So, and all this cognition, embedded cognition, or cognizant bodies are dealing with this in a self-organized process. Just to finish, so intentionality is a key issue on this development of skill. So we are moving beyond it's on the genes or in the mental representations, is the individual and the environment are key partners, and how the individual is moving towards the key aspects of the environment to perform a given skill and maintain that relationship over time. This implies the attunement, and by saying this, we are saying that the environment is constitutive of behavior. That's why coaches are so clever in designing tasks, like the coaches from Felipe Martins. And then how we act upon this information. And this is about the unique bodies that we have. The intelligence of the action is about how we are exploring and acting upon this environment to be successful in all these variations that every situation implies. And I think this is based on this metastable regime. And this is what we've been developing over times with Keith Davis and colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Duarte. An incredible presentation, as I knew it would be. So a big thank you for sharing with us. I invite Ryder and Keith are going to come have a discussion, and I will be on the side as well. Yeah, if someone I'd like to monitor the chat. So, all right, Charles.
Okay. Thank you, Duarte. Because you are more an expert into this field, I think, than I am. So I want to ask you some questions about the first part you presented, because you asked if the skills is in the genes or if it is in the mind, and you ended up telling us that it's in the dynamic process of the ancient environment system. And of course, I totally agree. So are we saying that it is in the relationship between the environment and the person?
Well, that is a very good question because it really has many implications. If we assume that skill is in the interaction, it means that skill do not exist before we are in the interaction. Yeah. And I think that cannot be the case. Otherwise, Felipe could not go to the championship and perform something at the level that she performed. So that would never happen to me. That happened with someone with that potentiality. So I think that there are some changes in the individual that facilitate this emergence to occur. So there are changes in the individual, and there are ways of perceiving and acting to better perceive in the environment that evolve over time and also change how the individual is, the muscles, the joints, the central nervous system, and everything else. So I think we cannot say that it's simply an emergent phenomenon. Otherwise, everybody could do what she did, and that is not the case. So I think it's rooted on how the individual is evolved to be able to act upon those affordances.
Yeah. Yeah. So we can say that genes need a kind of needs a social environment to develop, and the social environment needs genes to build on.
Well, yeah, I think in general, absolutely. So I think we have genes, that is a fact. Then there is a social environment, and that also influences how we are. So the issue is that my point is that I think we try to overemphasize a deterministic and causal relation between genes and behavior, and social environment and behavior. And I think these are aspects of how behavior is about. I think behavior is emergent. Skill, I think it's not emergent. That's why it's a potentiality. It emerges, it facilitates the emergence of behaviors, the actuality, the realization, but it implies development of the individual in order to be attuned to certain type of information and act upon that information. So skill, I think, has to do with how these mutual changes happen over time between the individual and the environment, but behavior, performance, this is emergent. This is from the relationship. And by saying this, I'm saying that genes are implied and the social aspects of performance are implied, but they are not the cause of behavior. They are constraints.
Yeah, but I'm a pedagogue, and I'm working with younger, not top athletes, and to me it's important to see that there is a kind of relative plasticity in this process, because sometimes, or I guess I'm wrong, but we often think about the individual as a plastic individual who can kind of adapt or adjust according to the environment. But I think it's important for those who are coaching young people in particular, and for those PE teachers, to also realize that the environment is adjustable and plastic. So we end up in a kind of relative plasticity involving all the systems inside the person and also the environment. Can you respond to that?
Well, I fully agree. I fully agree that this is why skill is just a potentiality. It's not the behavior itself. So we are increasing the potentiality to be more adaptable, to enjoy more, to have better experiences with the environment. And better experience means to achieve what in this case Felipe wanted to do. So this is why it's a potentiality. But I also think, and this may be strange that I can say this, that there are limits to this adaptability. For example, if I start to training to go to the Olympics to do gymnastics, I think I will be very far away to the skill of Felipe. So I can improve and be adjusted, but this has to do also with my body and my past and the characteristics that I develop over time. So there's this equilibrium that we should make between adaptation, but also some sort of stabilization, adaptation, stabilization. And but of course, behavior is also always based on adjustment and adaptation. That's why the potentiality increases in some tasks, but not in others, this adaptation. And in another, for example, Felipe Martins, who by doing the training she is doing, does not necessarily will be better in chess or in track and field, but she's better in gymnastics.
Yeah. Thank you.
So if I can pick up on that, Duarte, hi, thanks for that really very fascinating presentation. Really captures the key ideas in our framework for me. You really showed why we have the term ecological dynamics, not just ecological psychology. The first part of the presentation addressed that, use of potential optic variables like tau for regulating action, but dynamics as well, changes over time, and you showed that beautifully with the changes through the different stages that Felipe Martins went through. And so it relates back to Ryder's point as well, that he made about the not just the things themselves, but the relationship between things. And that's what brings the dynamics in. That's what's important. It's very hard to understand, even as scientists and academics, for practitioners to understand that and apply that, but it's the relations between things, not just objects themselves. It was something that was emphasized in the discussion, the conversation with Carl this morning, and obviously it's coming out really nicely in your presentation. And of course that was, has been known since the input of Henri Poincaré, the French mathematician who invented dynamical systems theory, contributed greatly to it. That it's not things or objects that are important in our world, it's the relationships between things. And that for me captures the ecological dynamic scale, the relationship between the person and the environment. So another person may not have shown the resilience that Felipe showed in performing and having to go through that practice regime for 9 months, and then under pressure to produce it and try and produce it, and then having to deal with the instability still that was shown in competition. So for me, that captures the ecological dynamics framework and what it has to offer. One thing that I'm going to be controversial here, and since we're talking, your presentation is about cognition, I really like the term cognizant body because I have to declare that I'm not a fan, I think you knew this already, of embodied cognition, because it still seems to emphasize in the body. Embedded, that tends to capture more for me the relationship between things, the person and the environment, the embeddedness of the two, if you like. So any thoughts or comments on that?
Yeah, it's your comment really adds to this message. Both things. So the first is dynamics. It means that we are always evolving over time, and this also implies that we are opening. We are changing our body and our interactions with the world to be more open and more receptive to do some things. And it's important to understand that by doing this, by choosing a path of gymnastics, for example, we are not developing our skills in football. So this is there is a path that we are exploring, but it can be meaningful and rich, and it can fulfill the existence of Felipe, for example. So that dynamics is always there. That's why actuality is always unique. It's the performance and the moment of realization is not to implement a ready-made solution. It's always the unique way of dealing with the constraints of the person and the situation. So dynamics is completely essential to understand all the process, performance and learning. And about the idea of embeddedness and this tendency towards the embodied cognition, I fully agree with you. I think embodied cognition is another way that say that we are controlled by our cognition. And I think even though that cognition is very important, I think we can understand the world and interact in the world and discuss the world because we act. Acting, I think it's a foundation of our interaction with the world. It's what we do when we are born, even though that sometimes we act without any specific intentions. We just act to take meaning out of the world. That's the rhythmic movements from the babies. They are not really meant to do something else than to perceive what is going around them. When there is a sound, when there is a light that opens, when there is some texture that they feel. So this way of acting to become intelligent, to resolve the problems of the world, in the later stage to even discuss that by words. I think all this came from action. Action is really something that is central in human understanding. But given that we came from a very Cartesian tradition that separates the mind from the body, and then the body, all the things related with the body were of a secondary level. So the important things were the intellectual things that were almost body free. We took many centuries to understand how action was central. And I think that meetings like this one are really putting that up, to showing that action is central to our intelligence, to our existence, to take meaning, to have the meaning, to offer meaning to our lives.
Thank you very much, Duarte. Thank you, everyone. I want to bring in a few people to this conversation, and then we're going to have a 10-minute break just to allow everyone in the room here to stretch their legs before we start with Jai. But I'd like to bring in David, Andrew, and also Jai, if you wouldn't mind joining us as well, as you are going to be our next presenter, so you can segue in. So that'd be wonderful for free. And yeah, so just so you're on the screen.
Quick question. First of all, thank you for the excellent presentation. It was very, very stimulating. But just hearing the different presentations today, do you feel, Duarte, that there is a tension between the scales of analysis at the level of task dynamics and information, perspective information, specification, and then larger scale analyses like, forms of life, wayfinding, and so on?
Well, in short, I don't think there is I think they are very much aligned. Why do you think there is a controversy? Where there is tension?
I think what I was thinking about was some of the Gibsonian terms are framed in a first-person perspective, say, for example, like tau variable, and they can be quantified or measured, as opposed to the way that maybe we speak about a form of life. We maybe can understand it as an extension of, similar dynamics at a larger scale, but there's maybe different challenges in regards to measurement and quantification. How do you think about how we do science at those different scales?
Okay, very nice. This was a point me and Carl discussed on the last paper we wrote together. Well, I think what Carl is emphasizing is very important. I think and he's always emphasizing action. So action is, even when a coach asks a question, it doesn't matter the answer, it's what matters is how the athlete is acting. So, and I think this illustrates well how these things are aligned. But what also Carl is adding to this is that we humans, we talk, we have narratives about things. And this is part of how we are in the world, of how we make ourselves in the world. So if this is a part of how we act, so it can also be part of the explanation. So these narratives, this storytelling are part of it, but it's not exclusive to it. That is not the only thing. So we are not just searching for narratives. We are using also narratives also as a constraint to empower our action. And all these aspects can be measured at different levels. Even the narratives can be measured in the ways that are not direct. And I think you are emphasizing that. I can measure narratives by questionnaires, for example, but this is not something that we tend to use. But it's a possibility. We tend to capture these influences on behavior based on ecophysical variables. So I think that these narratives and the way the story is being told and is being developed over time will have impact in how we act in the world, and we can measure that impact of how we act in the world with ecophysical variables. So these things I think are aligned.
Excellent, thank you.
Welcome.
Jai, do you have anything you'd like to, before we'll take a 10-minute break in a minute, just so everyone in here has been sitting for a long time, but would you like to say anything on this? I know back in 2011, you wrote a really interesting ecological.
No, I think it's fine. I think everybody needs a break at this point in time.
All right.
I don't want to be the one standing between the break and.
we'll let you get set up, and everyone here. And just a big thank you again to It's an incredible presentation.
Thank you.
Everyone, but I'll do that again, just very short, a slightly shorter version. This is the first hybrid symposium we have done, but I'm hoping it'll be the first of many. Okay, first I'll just say that again. A very warm welcome to Jai Yi, who's joining us all the way from Singapore. It's an absolute pleasure to have him, and his presentation I know will really follow on beautifully from Carl's and Duarte's presentations. On a personal note, as I just mentioned, Jai's work has heavily influenced my own work in physical education. So I'm very grateful and appreciate you being here, Jai. So thank you, and I will pass over to you now.
Thank you, James, and thank you for the organizers for providing me with this opportunity to come and speak. I wish I could be in Norway at this point in time, but unfortunately not. So maybe in the future. So I will just share a little bit about teaching and learning with nonlinear pedagogy. So let me share screen.
Yeah, share screen. Cheers.
Yeah. So yeah, I hope you can see it. All good. So for this sharing, I'm just going to touch on two main parts. I think first would just to share a little bit about what nonlinear pedagogy is. And the second part, I'm going to spend some time to leverage on a very recent empirical work that we've done to talk a bit about what or how nonlinear pedagogy or learning in nonlinear pedagogy may look like, with reference to then how do we possibly assess learning from a nonlinear pedagogy perspective. So that's the two main parts that I would just like to cover. And of course, then I welcome conversations with everyone here. But before I begin, I just want to show a very short clip here. Yeah. Yeah, just for a while, just let me do that again because I need to share sound. Yeah. Okay, so it's amazing, right? It's an amazing place, and I visited a collaborator, and this was his attic, and he basically built a whole bouldering or climbing wall in his attic, and his kids, as you could see, were actually just enjoying themselves. And you can imagine, going back to Carl and Duarte's presentation, the environment that is available, the interactions are so critical. The development of skill doesn't just reside within the child or the learner, it's the interaction with the environment. And one of the key factors, obviously, in the environment is also the practitioner, the teacher, the educator. And I always ask my students, and I'm involved in teacher preparation, teacher education. My background is in PE teaching. And I always ask my student teachers, so what do you think are some of these effective principles behind teaching? What are some of these effective principles that you believe in that would really support successful teaching and skill adaptation? And some of these principles are as seen here: student-centeredness, a focus on the learner, clearly, emphasis on exploratory learning, bearability in practice, And interestingly, a number of them indicated that the teachers need to play a facilitative role as well. And of course, as we have heard probably from a couple of presentations, that there is an emphasis on individualized movement competency. And these are some of these principles or ideas that seem or perceived to be critical or important to support effective teaching. And I think rightly so. I think these are increasingly some of these ideas that are popular to suggest that those are the key factors that support effective teaching. And of course, we also need to then go back to have a look at how our learners behave. Right? Do they behave like complex systems? What are some of these features of non-linearity that we see in learning? So for example, I think we see changes can be non-proportional. No, meaning that sometimes you can practice for a long time and then you don't see increases in performance. And sometimes you tweak certain things, you practice for a short while, maybe you use a new equipment or certain instructions were given to you, and you see huge significant changes in the way you perform. And this is one key feature that we do see in learning as example of non-linearity in learning. But not just that, we also recognize there are multiple ways to achieve an outcome, right? There are multiple ways to throw an object towards a target. It could be an overarm throw, it could be a sidearm throw, it could be an underarm throw. It's a different way of doing this. And of course, it relates to the idea of degeneracy. And there are obviously key observations that we can respond to changing variables in the learning environment or in the performance environment as well. Right? For example, when you tweak the size of the object to be thrown, you can use either a one-handed throw or a two-handed throw. Or you could maybe tweak the size of the playing area, small area to a bigger area, and it affords different opportunities of actions. Whether you can have more passes or dribbling, keeping the ball in a better way when the size of the playing grid is altered from small to big. So we are capable of responding to these changing variables. And not just that, we know, and lots of empirical work has been done as well, that when you add noise or variability into the practice, there are opportunities for the learners to move from one pattern of behavior to a new pattern of behavior. So basically, there are opportunities to explore new movements. And these are features that are inherent, that are present in many, many learning contexts. And these are examples of non-linearity in learning. And as such, we really do see learners behaving as self-organizing neurobiological systems. So the big question is this then: if learners behave like complex systems, then should we then consider pedagogical approaches to account for this? So that was a question that I've been asking myself for a long time. And I'm just going to share a very short clip with you about maybe what nonlinear pedagogy could look like.
Do you find yourself constantly teaching the same old one-size-fits-all drills? Why not try nonlinear pedagogy? Nonlinear pedagogy, or NP for short, is a teaching approach that could help students learn sport skills better. It involves three key principles. The first involves incorporating variability in practice. The second is to create representative learning designs. And the third is about simplifying tasks. Sounds like too much to handle? Let's break it down for you. When we talk about incorporating variability in practice, this simply means setting different limits for your students by playing around with different factors. This could be as simple as throwing around different sized balls, for example, to challenge your students to find different ways of catching balls. Students can thus find their own ways to achieve the task outcome. Next, creating representative learning designs means that you are guiding your students to play and learn in different and realistic game scenarios. For example, instead of letting them practice with stationary cones, you could pit them against opponents or get them to compete in small-sided games. Lastly, simplifying tasks would allow students to focus better on the movement outcome. Again, this could mean something as simple as swapping a small ball for a bigger ball that's easier to hit. Students can thus focus on the ball's trajectory instead of struggling to get the correct form of movement. In contrast to one-size-fits-all, technique-dominated approaches, NP provides more opportunities for students to collaborate, explore, and come up with their own ways to move. It also caters for learning differences between students and highlights that there are many ways of achieving the same outcome. So how do you get started? You can follow these steps. Firstly, you could roughly demonstrate the movement instead of telling them exactly how to do it. You should also give your students the time and space to try out the different movements. When necessary, use questions to guide them to focus on the task goal instead of telling them exactly how to do it. Lastly, encourage your students to learn by working together. If you'd like to know more about non-linear pedagogy, visit the Knowledge Bank website.
So this is a very short clip just to introduce basically what nonlinear pedagogy is. And we know that in typical context, when we teach and when we get our students to practice, there's a lot of emphasis previously on using prescriptive instructions and a lot of emphasis on repetitive drills. So typically, many practitioners would focus on repetition and getting a specific movement form and in a way that's consistent all the time. But that is an issue in itself because the transfer of learning is reduced or difficult to achieve because these repetitive drills, while it is very good in the drill setting and the practice setting, the actual transfer to game context, performance context could be lacking. So in contrast, when we look at nonlinear pedagogy, it's a lot of emphasis on exploratory learning, a lot of emphasis on looking at having individualized movement solutions. And we talk about the use of a lot of representative learning environments to provide those important perceptual information that can be functional and useful for the learners to then use it to guide their own actions. So the earlier clip itself is a very short clip, but highlighted a few key principles of nonlinear pedagogy, and they are underpinned obviously by the concepts from ecological dynamics. And we know that nonlinear behaviors actually just emerge at various levels, right? At the individual, at the game, and of course, clearly at the PE context too. And as highlighted earlier on by Keith, James, Duarte, and Carl as well, the focus is really on the interactions, right? And by having a nonlinear pedagogy approach, we are really focusing on the kind of interactions that occur, and specifically how would then those interactions support skill adaptation, skill acquisition. And particularly for nonlinear pedagogy, we are also looking at some of these key design principles to support learning, to support teaching. And from this slide here, you could see that at the middle of it all, it is a focus on learner-centeredness. And we probably are familiar with the constraints-led approach here, looking at the performer, the task, and the environment, and how they interact with each other. And then you see goal-directed behavior. And as I mentioned to you, there is a greater emphasis for nonlinear pedagogy with reference to design principles. And one of the key design principles is to create representativeness in the practice environment. Representativeness meaning that we want to simulate how, in the practice situations, the skills would be performed. Therefore, providing in a possession game or a passing activity, the presence of a defender, of players, teammates. So you create an environment and the representative learning context to allow the learners to become more attuned to the kind of perceptual information that's available, and then in itself guiding action eventually. Constraints manipulation is another key design principle that we espouse a lot in nonlinear pedagogy, meaning that think about scaling constraints, scaling task constraints, right? We know that rules, task goal, equipment, those are important constraints under tasks that could be manipulated. And we can scale them or design them in ways to encourage learners to search for functional behaviors. So constraints manipulation is a key aspect of nonlinear pedagogy. The other one is task simplification, and this obviously has a lot of reference to strengthening perception action coupling, right? We simplify the tasks rather than decompose the task. So by simplifying, we're reducing the temporal and spatial difficulty for the learners. So again, like I say, using shorter rackets for a badminton serve is a lot easier. Using bigger size balls when you are throwing the ball, that allows for greater flight time, and it's a lot easier for the receiver to collect it. So task simplification is again an example of a key design principle in nonlinear pedagogy. Be a bit more sensitive to the impact of informational constraints. So whether it's more movement outcome oriented or whether it's more movement form oriented, because it has implications on the level of conscious control of movement. So anything that's a bit more movement form oriented can elicit a lot more conscious control, whereas something that is more outcome oriented, again, can allow more emergent behaviors because you are not focusing on how you move. And therefore, in itself, creates an opportunity for the learner to find individualized movement solutions. Functional variability is kind of linked to the earlier point when we looked at how learners behave like complex systems, right? So variability in terms of providing the opportunity for learners to explore within a practice context itself, many possibilities. You add practice variability in there. And these design principles, they can work together or work independently, or it's not a rule to say they all have to work together at the same time. But these are ideas in terms of the design principles that are underpinned by ecological dynamics that within the non-linear pedagogy context. And they work through the channels of practice, instructions, and feedback. And then we see the emergence of co-directed behavior. So the key question then is, how would learning in non-linear pedagogy actually look like? So based on the design principles that I've kind of described, we would expect that the learners trying many different movement solutions. We would expect that the learners will be very much involved in problem solving, right? Because it's not a prescribed movement form that they're trying to adhere to, but always looking for possibilities, movement opportunities that are very much leveraged on the specific performer constraints, the individual learner. And we expect perhaps the capacity for the learners to use movement solutions for different contexts as well. So a lot of adaptability in there. And as I mentioned earlier on, we expect to see that there could be many individualized movement solutions. Optimal movement pattern for the individual are not across all individuals. So what then would be an indication of learning within the nonlinear pedagogy perspective? We reckon perhaps adaptability is one key feature. So adaptability is an indication of transfer. Because with adaptability, we would possibly recognize that there is a presence of flexibility as well as stability, and they are then key features of skill adaptation. So for a skilled learner or a skilled performer, when there's a need to be flexible, you have to be flexible. But yet, when situations require you to be stable, then stability comes about as well. And those are key features of adaptability. So the other indication if learning has occurred from a nonlinear pedagogical perspective would be exploration as well. We would expect the learner to be involved in a lot of exploratory processes. And the exploration can come through because of the variability in practice. And of course, exploration has to be aligned to whether it's functional or not as well. And how do we know whether it's functional? I guess if the exploration leads to an accomplishment of achieving a task goal, that in itself would be an indication of functionality. So it would seem that these are some of these indicators of learning and coming under the umbrella of adaptability here. So I'll take the opportunity here to also, as I mentioned earlier on, to share a very recent piece of work that looked at transfer from past learning experiences. So let me explain what this study is about. And hopefully from this study, we can get some insights about what we may think what learning, nonlinear pedagogy would be relevant for in terms of learning and assessing learning. So for this particular study, we looked at baseball batting tasks. And we were basically just interested to see, for example, if someone with certain previous learning experiences, how would that translate to them learning a new skill? Okay, so we have 3 groups of participants here, the expert group. So these are expert baseball players. So from the expert baseball players, we're able to determine what their movement patterns are like and what their performance outcome looks like. And we have 2 novice groups here. One would be novice players, novice to the baseball batting task, but they are athletes. So they could be runners, they could be swimmers, etc. And the other one would be the novice implement group. This would be novices to baseball, but they are also athletes. But then they would be athletes who are familiar with handling an implement. So they could be badminton players, squash players, tennis players. So similar in some ways to baseball players, but not obviously baseball players, but they are sports athletes who are familiar with using an implement. So we really want to know if there's a big difference when we are trying to teach these novice to baseball batting, whether if you are familiar with using an implement would have actually resulted in a different pathway to learning baseball batting tasks as compared to athletes who are not familiar with using an implement. So that really is the purpose of this study. So let's look at some simple results here. So these are performance outcome data. So let's look at ball speed first. So this is the y-axis showing the ball speed, and on the x-axis you have the expert group, the novice group, and the novice implement group. And we can see that there is significant difference, obviously, between the novice and the expert, and also between the novice and the novice implement group. Okay. And in terms of variability of ball speed, in terms of hitting the ball, we see again very clear significant difference between the expert and the novice. So it shows here, especially for the novice group, even while they were trying to bat, they were really quite different in terms of the way the experts were able to do it. Right? And let's take a look at this slide in terms of the movement patterns here. The y-axis shows you the number of occurrences of movement patterns. So we had the kinematics there, and we were able to determine the movement patterns of the 3 groups of participants. And on the x-axis, we have the different movement patterns. So this would be the novice patterns, this would be the novice implemented, and then this would be the expert participants. And what did we find? The novice implemented participants have movement patterns that are more similar to the expert participants. So you could see here. So these are the experts, and we have the novice implement ones, a bit more similar to the experts. But we also have the same novice implement participants also having some of these movement patterns that are similar to the novice participants as well. So it seems that those with some experience using an implement were able to demonstrate some of these movement patterns for the expert players, but also still some for the novice participants. So interestingly, what we are trying to indicate here is that it is not really about getting the novice implement participants to demonstrate a specific movement form or movement pattern that the experts are demonstrating, but rather through this study, we are able to see that the novice implemented participants, because of their experience with using an implement, are able to show a range of different movement patterns that were demonstrated by the expert participants here. So it seems that they have a diverse range because of their experience previously. And this slide shows you the specific movement patterns demonstrated by each of these participants. So this is a novice group, and these are the movement patterns, 8 movement patterns here. And you can see quite clearly for these novice participants, typically the runners, the swimmers, no experience with the implement, they have very stable movement patterns demonstrated across trials. But when you look at the novice implement group, you can see that there are quite a little bit more exploration of the movement patterns for this novice implement group. You can see each of these dots represent a child, and you can see that there's a lot more, especially for your participants 6, 7, 8, quite a lot of exploration of those movement patterns. These ones here, you'll be wondering, why is it so stable? So participant 3 and 4 actually are the ones who are demonstrating the movement patterns shown by the expert participants here. So you could see for the novice implement group, a lot more exploration as well, because potentially of the experience that they have in their own game, in their own sports. So greater exploration here, as I mentioned, for novice implement, but exploration in practice, perhaps as an indication of effective learning, and of course, coupled with performance outcome. And a couple of slides ago, as I mentioned to you, especially between the novice implemented and the expert, there was actually no difference for many of the performance outcome. So what are the implications here for assessment? Perhaps a focus on adaptability. Also, perhaps looking at exploratory behaviors coupled with functional performance outcome. Could we also, when we assess learning from a nonlinear pedagogical perspective, to see whether the learners are able to demonstrate an array of movement solutions possible? Right. So these are some of these implications that perhaps we could consider. And of course, the greater implication is perhaps also consider nonlinear pedagogy in teaching and learning based on the design principles that were shared. And also think about how would learning in nonlinear pedagogy look like. Because with that in mind, then you can better make connections with your design principles together with the assessment of learning based on a nonlinear pedagogy approach. So the greater implications as well would be, maybe we need to rethink assessment rubrics in PE and sports. Again, because many of the assessment rubrics tend to be very movement form oriented or just performance outcome oriented. But perhaps we need to look deeper beyond movement form and performance outcome and look at some of those features pertaining to adaptability, pertaining to individualized movement solutions, right? And of course, pertaining to exploration as well. Could we factor those key features into the way we assess learning? And that could be a better reflection of how inherently many of our learners learn skills, and they demonstrate non-linearity in learning. And again, going back to teaching, then can we then think about a non-linear pedagogical approach to account for that non-linearity in itself? So thank you very much. I know this is a very short presentation, but I hope I've covered in brief some of these key ideas of nonlinear pedagogy and hopefully provided some insights about assessing learning and how learning may look like from a nonlinear pedagogical approach. And obviously, this is not just my work, and I've had a lot of collaborators working on this as well. And we have a few here. That's like James, Keith, Duarte, some examples. And of course, my colleagues like John Koma, Ludovic Seifert, Chris Button, Ian Renshaw. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joe. That was a wonderful presentation, and you certainly did fit a lot in, and certainly there's a lot for us to discuss. So I'm going to invite Monica to join me up here, and we'll start to have a conversation, and then we'll invite people in the audience. I can see there's been a few comments we can also bring into the chat. I have a few points, Joanna. I'm really pleased you touched on assessment there at the end, because I think we've had a discussion before, but really assessment drives pedagogical practice in physical education. And beyond physical education, education more generally, where teachers will teach towards those assessments, those tests. So you started to get mentioned those rubrics or rethinking of different types of assessments, which potentially are starting to assess more about generality, looking at transfer between. Have you had any more thoughts on what that could look like within a physical education? Have you, in Singapore, where you've been leading on this work, have you been exploring other types of assessment?
Yeah, thanks, James. I think that's a very pertinent question. And I really like your point there. You know, assessment shapes behaviors, and assessment shapes teachers' behaviors particularly. So it depends really on the curriculum and the syllabus, right? In terms of how they determine assessment. And let's look at foundational movement skills, right? And we know typically, James, that a lot of the rubrics are very movement form oriented, right? You need to move your arms this way, you need to move your legs this way, and then we want to see different level of maturity in those movements, and then we grade accordingly. And because of that, teachers, while they believe in exploratory learning, they believe in individualized movement solutions, they believe in ideas on constraints-led approach and nonlinear pedagogy per se, but they are forced then to teach in a way to meet those expectations of the assessment rubrics. So they feel the tension, James. I'm not sure what your own experiences are like. But in Singapore, yeah, in Singapore, I have many teachers coming up to me and say, Jai, really like nonlinear pedagogy, really like constraints-led approach, but yet, you know, traditionally we are still asked to assess foundational movement skills based on movement form. And that's a struggle. And that's a struggle, honestly. But there are changes. I'm very happy to also indicate and share that within those assessment rubrics, there are indicators to encourage, for example, when you assess learners, are they able, just an example, are they able to throw to different distances? Are they able to throw to different directions? Are they able to use different size implements for throwing and catching? So that has slowly been incorporated into some of these assessment rubrics.
Just to that point, because no, I see that as well. I can see it changing, but the perceptual information to a tutor potentially is not in. They will still want to do that in a closed environment sometimes. So instead of saying, "Can you throw this in?" That boy's running over there, give him the ball. So, or girls, so trying to get them to see that the perception and action stays coupled during these assessment tasks as well. So yeah, no, I just wanted to say that point because I see those changing, but it's sometimes still this decoupled.
Yes.
Yeah, so we still have this replication of something,
Yes.
of this idea of a schema going on. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly right, James. I totally agree with you. So for example, peer evaluation, working in pairs, throwing to one another. I mean, that creates that platform, right, for perceptual action coupling to be strengthened, you know, and obviously evaluation or assessments within certain performance contexts, modified games, you know, that's where the skills are executed, are performed, you know, within that performance context or game setting as well. So therefore, in terms of assessment, then those contexts needs to be replicated to allow that indication or that transfer, right, of that skills into that performance context to emerge, to allow us to then see that that skill is actually functional in the actual performance setting as well. I think those are important things that possibly needs to be included when assessment comes into play, you know, especially in PE setting, I would say, right, for the educators and the teachers to make a better gauge of whether learning has actually occurred or not. And of course, when you put that in there, then like you pointed out right at the beginning as well, it shapes teaching practices, it shapes pedagogical practices. And then the teachers will start to infuse a lot more of the ideas of modified game representative learning design, simplifying the task, adding variability into the practices, you know, using more analogy, for example, because it encourages individualized movement behaviors. It encourages exploration. It encourages adaptation. And then you should be able to see those behaviors emerging when the students are assessed, because that's what you were trying to encourage in your lessons anyway. Yeah, so we are moving in that direction, but it is a huge mindset change too.
Yeah.
And one of the challenges I would indicate would be that sometimes teachers are a little bit uncomfortable because they are not in authority to specifically prescribe, right, what the movement should be. And when it comes to assessment, they may find it challenging to assess what is adaptation, right? What is exploration? I think that perhaps is an inherent fear that educators may have. Yeah.
Okay, wonderful.
Yeah, thank you very much for a very interesting talk. I have some questions for you about, have you thought about how the children are very different? They could have different ages. We are teaching children with high and low motor competence. We are teaching children with the different perceived motor competence. We might have different cultural contexts, how they respond to this kind of non-linear teaching. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, thank you for the question. And we do know in our class, we see all sorts, right? Different shapes and sizes, and they come to you at different levels as well, different levels of competencies. And it's always a challenge, right? And of course, traditionally, I think many educators feel that, well, they all come in different sizes. We want to fit them into the one size, and we're going to teach in one way, and everybody will fit into that particular mode. But of course, then the inherent challenge is not everybody is able to do that, because you don't give room for that. You don't give room for differences. But whereas perhaps from a practitioner point of view, looking at non-linear pedagogy, you are also scaling different constraints, scaling task constraints. You are able to use a variety of instructions or equipment. So even for the same activity of passing and throwing, but if you are able to make available different size objects to be thrown, you are able to scale your instructions and scale the rules of the game, where you are able to then manipulate the level of difficulty. And from there, you are able to then align or provide different levels of difficulty or different equipment that the learners can use based on their perceived competency, for example. And that gives the learners the autonomy to then use or tweak rules accordingly for themselves to still achieve some form of success. So that lies with reference to the idea of differentiated instructions, because non-linear pedagogy then provides the opportunity for differentiated instructions for learners, even within the same class setting, that you would have a diverse range of learners with different capacity or different competencies as well. So then it is the educator, the teacher, to then skillfully manipulate those task constraints, the rules, the equipment, to engage different kids differently. So that is the opportunity in terms of how the teachers may see themselves as designer of practice, and therefore tweaked it accordingly for different learners with different capabilities. So I hope that gives you some idea of some of these possibilities with non-linear pedagogy.
I have also a question about the teachers, because they could also be very different with a lot of experiences or less experienced. How they work in the professional community to be safe or to be comfortable to doing this kind of teaching. Have you any thoughts about experienced teachers versus novice teachers?
Yes, thanks for that. And I think this is a very pertinent question as well. Not all teachers are comfortable with these ideas of non-linear pedagogy. Some teachers are still very comfortable with very prescriptive command style, top-down approach, and they feel that repetition works. And it's not easy to sometimes work with some of these teachers who firmly believe in those practices. But they also recognize through my conversations and my work as well that there are value in these ideas from non-linear pedagogy. And some of them would say, well, we have a hybrid of this, a linear and a non-linear as well. So again, it is about mixing the two sometimes, for some of these practitioners. And some of them may start off with a bit of linear and then move on to non-linear thereafter, because they want the learners to have some approximation of the movement, and thereafter provide that games and that representative learning design to move on from there. So there are practitioners who say, look, we have a bit of a hybrid in there, and I think that's fine. And going back to your question as well, like comparing between experience and less experience, and one of the key features about non-linear pedagogy is also that the person who's delivering it must know your game and your sports very well. Because if you are not, then you may not be familiar with what constraints to scale or manipulate to channel your learners to search for, certain functional movement solutions. So one of those key challenges is obviously for the practitioners to know your sport and your game well. If not, it could be a challenge as well.
Can I just jump in here quickly, because it's where I
Yes.
slightly see where we start to blur the lines between the role of a coach and the role of a teacher. So a teacher can not know every sport and all the different activities out there. And actually, they're probably working more at this generality end of the teaching spectrum. So they can take an activity from a book, which creates the constraints, and we will see certain skills emerge from that. Being a game of handball, I mentioned yesterday, throwing and catching will emerge. You then can be using an external attention or focus, be more often like, okay, well done. Can you show me another way of getting the ball to that person? What about the person on the left over there? They're free. So you're starting to create these external attention or focus. But so I think, how much do we need to know, like, around the specificity of the actual game rules or the game activities to kind of keep supporting the exploration and innovation through movement? If we're seeing those movements become stable, we can look to perturbate through changing activities. So yeah, I understand we need to be confident in our teaching to experiment and explore, but it's about, where do we draw the line between having real expertise and to keep supporting kind of that generality of exploration through movement? And I think as a teacher, that's maybe where we need to be working towards a little bit. So I think coaches know the rules, know all the games, know the ins and outs, and maybe converging towards certain tactical plays or represented plays which are going to win in competitive games. And a teacher may want to work there as well, but also trying to think about those others. So I think it's an area we need to keep exploring and thinking about, how teachers aren't going to know everything. They aren't, as Keith mentioned earlier, the fonts of all knowledge. And so they may need to bring in resources, but actually be movement educators, understand and explore a movement. Ryder, I see you had your hand up here. Did you have something you wanted to mention?
Yes, I do. And I think this discussion on exploration of movement is interesting, of course. But I think in the future, at least from a Norwegian point of view, we have to take the theory further, because performance and skills in physical education may include a lot. And in some nations, it includes also more academic knowledge. It includes reflection. So this discussion is very activity oriented. We're talking about skills and activity, game rules, and so on. I just want to cite one of the competence aims in the Norwegian schools that are supposed to, or the pupils is expected to be able to, for example, reflect on how different presentations of the body in media and society affect movement activity, and how the pupil sees his or her body and self-image. So it's quite different from what we are talking about. And this is very important for the physical education, at least in our country, to move forward, to be a very relevant subject in the schools. So I just needed to comment on that. I think it is important that we don't stay with this skill acquisition or the skill orientation and activity orientation. We need to think that at least in physical education, there are more aims to reach.
I think we may have found the title for our next symposium. So we're moving on.
Yes, just a comment as well to that.
Where we can potentially start to go next, and there is obviously much broader things at play here, which we need to start considering.
Certainly, and I agree with that comment as well. I mean, while the focus of the sharing was really on skill adaptation and skill acquisition, but obviously we know from physical education perspective, it is beyond that. It's the holistic development of the child. There's a lot more learning outcomes and desired learning outcomes that we are looking for physical education. So I totally agree with you on that point. And going back to James' point, if I just have a bit of time, just that, yes, you're right. I think for physical education teachers, you need to have a good foundation of the knowledge across the games, but it doesn't mean that you have to be an expert in each of those games. And some of the ideas pertaining to encouraging exploration and task manipulation can be transferable across games and across activities as well. You know, that's where the teachers can recognize, okay, how can I encourage exploration in a net barrier game versus a territorial game, you know, versus a striking game, right? So there are some of these inherent ideas that could be transferable across these different classes of games as well. So what I'm saying is, yes, obviously from the teacher preparation perspective, we need to prepare our PE teachers to a certain level. And of course, if you are an expert in a particular sport, that is great, you know, but obviously, like you say, you know, at least a foundational level that they can then, you know, at least skillfully think about themselves as designers of practice for those different classes of games or sports or physical activity. Yeah.
Bring in those notions of co-design, which Carl Woodson's talked about as well, using expertise in the class. Just going back to Ryder's point, and it's a really lovely comment in the chat around, like, again, it's exploration or wayfinding through different environments, and children are developing knowledge of environments through this exploration into the online spaces, into these other areas. So there is a philosophical shift here, again, which I hinted at yesterday around learning and what we're understanding, how we're understanding that and moving towards physical education knowledge of the environment and how they are navigating and bringing these back into an embodied sense. So yeah, I think it's a conversation we need to keep having, and that's what this round table, so we're going to be talking about this afternoon. So the round table is really now about bringing all this about and starting to say how we're going to move forward from this event. Jai, thank you so much for your time today. Monica, did you have any final?